Tell me how you got involved with Hawaii Five-0.
Well, I was winding down at Mirish Ridge. Rapatol didn't look like it was going to be picked up. I was called originally to work on the pilot of Hawaii Five-0 by Eddie Denault, who was running production at CBS. And I turned it down because I thought Rapatol was going to continue at the time. And a few months later, when it looked like it wasn't, Eddie called back and said they've sold the series, and would I like to go over there and work on the show? And I says, well, I'm still pushing to get into the Directors Guild, and if I go over there, I'll be out of sight and out of mind. He says, well, we'll try to help you on that, and we'll call you Assistant Production Manager. That was a title they created. I didn't work on the pilot, as I mentioned. A fellow named Bob Rosen was a production manager on the pilot. He didn't come back on the series. He became a producer on some other shows. And they hired Robert Huddleston. And Bob and I hit it off. And Bob did the first and the start of the second year. In those days, when I was hired, Bob was already over there. And they were working out of a building that had been a former lumbers and material building for offices, and we had to find a stage, and they ended up using an old warehouse in Pearl City. It was a former warehouse for the military during the war. Had no air conditioning, was about a 30-minute drive from Honolulu, and that's the way we did the first season and almost 2 seasons. And we had to improve on that because the actors were working in suits and wringing wet. In those days, they had the theory if we had a big Ritter fan and ice, we could keep the stage cool. But that never worked, of course. And so I started looking for a place to relocate us. Bob left after the second season, and they put in one of the, Bob left towards the tail end of the first year because he had problems back in the mainland, family problems. And Mike Glick, who has a big name in production, he presently works at AFI, he was one of the ADs, and he took the show. I couldn't because I still wasn't in the guild. And the next season, Bob came back again, and he left again because of other problems. And they gave it to the other assistant director, Max Stein. Again, I couldn't get it. I was still working as the assistant. So I had told a guy named Frank Barton, who was a network vice president, happened to call one day and was talking about one of the scripts. And he said, well, next year, blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, I won't be here next year because I've, been unable to move into the job that I really want to do. And I think I should get back on the mainland because I'm out of sight, out of mind, out of sight over here. And he said, well, does Lenny know that? That's Leonard Freeman, the creator of Hawaii Five-0. And I said, no, I haven't really discussed it with Lenny because I was hired by Eddie Denault and Bob Nervette. He said, would you mind if I told him? And he did, and Lenny called me a few hours later and said, well, I'm president of the Producers Guild. I've got a hit show, on CBS, and I don't know why I can't make you my production manager. So he went, into that and got CBS and Bob and Eddie, and they talked to the guild. I had a lot of promises, a lot of letters and things. Probably couldn't happen today like that, but it happened. And starting the third season, I was the production manager for the next 7 years, or the next 8 years, I guess it was. And then I came back later and supervised the show from here with the production manager that worked under me.
So tell me about the beginnings of the actual production of Hawaii Five-0. Was it ever considered that the show not be shot in Hawaii, or was that a slam dunk from the beginning?
That was something that Leonard Freeman wanted to do and convince CBS that the only way the show was going to really work was to do it in Honolulu. Lenny conceived the show. His mother-in-law was living in the islands at the time, and they would go over, he and his wife, Rose Freeman, and he said, that the show would, be something that I would like to do over here, but what would I do? And he met with various people over in Honolulu, one of which was the governor at that time, was John Burns. And the governor told him about a police unit that he wanted to put together, but it had never been done yet, called 5-0. And that's how Lenny got the idea of conceiving Hawaii 5-0, by talking with the governor. And he wrote a pilot that was produced partly there and partly in the States in 1968.
Were there studios that already existed in Hawaii to shoot interiors, or did something have to be built from the ground up?
No, there were no stages at the time. Shows that, like Hawaii and I, had been shot, pieces of it there. And I'm trying to remember the old Richard Boone series. They would either shoot in warehouse, and I can't think of the name of it right now.
And Magnum, was Magnum later or about
Magnum
that time?
came in after us, and
Okay.
Magnum used our soundstage, right?
Okay.
There was like a year or two between 5-0 and Magnum.
So you went over to Hawaii and
So, well, we already talked about the stage,
Yeah.
how that originated. When we finally we started looking for locations, and we liked, I saw the property in Fort Ruger. It was a National Guard controlled it at that time, and they also controlled inside Diamond Head itself. And there was land there where we thought we could put up a Butler building, like a prefab building. And originally, we were turned down because there was some exclusive, very expensive homes nearby who resisted our coming there. And they formed an association called the East Diamond Head Association. And we kept appealing to them, and there were hearings at the city council. It went on for quite some time between the the second and third season. But we finally convinced them that we would be unobtrusive and we'd go out quietly in the morning and come back. And inside the stage, we wanted quiet anyway. So we got a permit to build on the former construction developer agreed to put up the facility, and they formed what they call a hui, which is a local business arrangement, to build the stage, and they had local investors. And we put up this Butler building and 4 prefab houses for office buildings inside Fort Ruger. And we kept that, so was it the 6th or 7th season, we had to give it back to the National Guard, and we moved on to another piece of property on the Fort Ruger area and build another soundstage and move the prefab office buildings. And today, they're just a few feet away from that stage, the state built a regular soundstage with concrete and 16,000 square foot. Ours was about 12,000 square feet because we developed, a film industry there.
which was my next question. I was going to say, Hawaii 5-0 did break ground in shooting in Hawaii, right?
Yes.
For both features and TV shows that came later?
Later. Lost, at least the stage they originally shot in a warehouse too for a few months until the stage became available. But ABC leased the facility for Lost. The new 5-0, though, couldn't get into the old stage or the new stage because ABC had it leased and wouldn't let it go. So the morning newspaper, which went out of business, the Honolulu Advertiser, was empty, and the current Hawaii 5-0 is shooting in the Honolulu Advertisers, where they had the presses. They cleaned those out and made that the sound stage, and the office building. They're using some of the offices for production offices.
Did you shoot on more than one island?
We shot a couple of shows on the Big Island, and we also shot one show in Maui, and we also shot one in Hong Kong over the years, part of one show in Hong Kong. And we used other parts of Oahu for other parts of the island, you know. We called it, you know, one of the other islands.
Tell me about your decision, or how it unfolded, that you had a family, kids, and
Right.
what did you anticipate at the beginning of having to move to Hawaii, and how long did you actually?
Okay, initially I went over in February of the year that I went over. It was '69, and I went by myself, and I was there about 3 months, and decided I didn't like living in a hotel, and then I was out without my family. I had 4 kids. They were 2, 3, 6, and 9 at the time. So I called my wife and said, you know, I would find a house and they should come over. And within a month they were there. We eventually sold our house in Northridge that we were living at the time. And a few years later we bought the house that we were living in Honolulu. And they started school over there. You know, they were the ones that were 6 and 9 that were going to school in elementary school. In those days, you didn't wear shoes. I didn't, you know, when I first went over there, I didn't know if they had a mall, and, you know, I had never been there. But, you know, they had everything that we had here. But some of the things were a little, you know, primitive compared to how we live in the States. Or that is a state, on the mainland, I should say. I got over that real fast.
Did your family take to it pretty quickly?
They loved it. Yeah, they didn't want to leave there when they came back. They were all crying.
And how long were you there?
I was there 10 years. Yeah, and sometime between seasons, off seasons, I would come back and do a pilot here. Or once I went to London and did a 2-hour movie, Coffee, Tea, or Me. And I would, the season that I left Honolulu, I did a pilot called Big Hawaii with one of the producers who worked on Hawaii Five-0. Perry Lafferty and Bill Finnegan were working on a project for Filmways called Big Hawaii. It was another show to go on the islands, and I worked on it as associate producer, production manager, and if it sold as a series, they offered me to be the producers. It did sell, but at the same time, I was offered a job to come back here to head up production for CBS on the West Coast. So I elected to do that because I didn't feel that Big Hawaii was going to go that long, and it didn't.
When you started on Hawaii Five-0, had it already been cast, or were you in at the very beginning when that hadn't been decided?
It had already been cast except for the part of Dano. There was another actor who played Dano in the pilot, and then they felt that wasn't working, and they brought in Jimmy MacArthur. But the rest of the cast had already been picked. And over the years, they brought in other local casts for some of the police on the unit. Like Kem Fong was replaced in later years by Al Harrington, a local entertainer. Then Mo Kiala came in, was another local guy that was cast. And they did a lot of local castings. Initially, they had brought over Ted Thorpe as the casting director for the local hires, and then they had somebody on the mainland doing the mainland casting. But we would use 15 to 20 speaking parts from local. That was a good part of the show's success, was the local casting, because they developed people that had never, worked as actors before. We had guys that were lawyers or bank executives or any number of things. Shea Fong was a savings and loan executive. There was one, I can't think of his name right now, who became a great menacing, Japanese killer. That was a lawyer over there. I can't think of it. And there were a few that came back and worked here afterwards because of the experience they got over there.
Movies are known for hiring stars. TV is known for making stars. What level where was Jack Lord when he first started compared to the prominence and fame he finally acquired with that show?
Right. Well, Jack acted like a star from the beginning. Jack was a tough taskmaster. He was very professional, but he was very hard on people sometimes, and he was a perfectionist. I found out early on if I was going to survive on that series was to get along with Jack. And many times I would defray difficult, problems on the location and tell Jack that I would meet him later at the end of the day back at the office to tackle some of the things that were bothering him or what he needed, rather than stand, on the set in front of, the crew and the tourists and the rest of the cast, and do it in the confines of the office at the end of the day. But it worked. There were long hours. I'd be up at 5 in the morning to be on the set at 6 o'clock. I was always the first one there and the last to leave. But that's what it took, and I enjoyed doing it. Living in Hawaii was a paradise, and I was lucky to have a job like that.
Was Leonard Freeman on the set much?
Leonard would come over about 4 times a year. We talked a lot on the phone. He talked to Jack a lot on the phone. They would bring writers over, writers that Lenny would hire to get familiar with the islands, and we would do night rides. We'd go out in police cars, and I would go with them, and to get ideas, for scripts. At the initial few years, the idea originally was not to be a typical police show, it was to do unusual crimes that would go through the Pacific, and things like that. But, you can only do so many of those, and only so many stories like that. So we got in some, typical, kind of police shows towards the end.
How did Jack Lord get along with Lenny Freeman?
They got along very well. He respected Lenny, and Lenny was very talented with the scripts. And I'll give you a story of Lenny. The type, because in the islands there's a lot of crime. Less today, but in those days it was fairly loose. And we had some things disappearing from the set. And you don't have prop houses there where you can go and get things. And our decorator was a guy named Buck Henshaw, who had worked on Ross Hunter movies. He was a very talented. He grew up in the islands and came from a very influential family there, and they had a lot of good contacts. So a lot of the times he would dress the sets with things he got from people's homes. As I said, you just couldn't go to, the normal prop house and pick out things to dress a set. And occasionally things would disappear, and we knew it was the crew. And Lenny happened to be over at one time when we had these very expensive lamps that disappeared. And at the end of the day, he had asked me to assemble the crew, and he wanted to talk to them. And he had a beautiful way with words, and he could talk to everybody without accusing them. And that he said things like, we were a family and we worked together. And you got to take care of each other. And we have this job in the show, and we're here because of et cetera, et cetera. And sure enough, that night, those lamps, I was in signing time cards at the end of the day, and I heard a car pull up quick, and a couple of boxes were placed outside the gate, and they came back. So, dissolved. About a month later, something happened again. So I took a cue from Lenny. I sat down with the crew, and I made a similar speech. So that night, again, it was something, there were some vases, however you say it. And for some reason, whoever had them threw them over the fence, and they all got broken.
So much for the attempt to return them.
Yeah, right.
In one piece.
Exactly.
Were there rules about shooting Hawaii Five-0 in Hawaii? Were there things you had to, be mindful of? Any censorship items or things things that couldn't
Well,
be
the only
seen?
thing that would be, I wouldn't say, the police were fine. Early on in those days, we went to the police and we talked to them, and the chief, Kale, at that time was very cooperative, and the mayor, Frank Fossey, and we got a lot of great cooperation. The police cars you saw in the beginning were all city and county cars. The police officers were city and county police officers. We established a rate to pay them off duty. And in fact, a lot of the police officers used to tell me that their kids were able to go to private schools or go to college because of the income they were getting from the show. And it worked well for them, and it worked well for us. As they retired some of the old police cars while we were there, we bought some of them and refurbished them and painted them and had some of our own for the real rough stuff where we, had chases and crashes and things like that. The only restrictions are, you said, were with military. We used a lot of military equipment. We used destroyers, we used Coast Guard cutters, we used military planes, when available. And those scripts had to go, initially they had to go to Washington, to the Department of Defense. But because we did so much with the military, they finally gave us permission to work with the SINCPAC. SINCPAC was the commander of the Pacific Fleet, including all branches of the service. And the commander in those days was Admiral, wait a minute, stop for a minute. I'll think of this.
Right.
Pick up. When you're ready, I'll.
Right. Okay.
Okay. The commander in those days was Admiral McCain, the father of John McCain. And he gave us cooperation with each division. We could submit scripts if it's something to do with the Air Force or something to do with the Navy. And I worked a lot with a Major Abel, who later became a general. I'll tell you that in a minute. And they would give us Hickam Air Base or Pearl Harbor we shot on. And some of the ships, if they were out doing a training mission, for example, we could get on it. It wasn't no additional cost to the government. We always fit in to their schedule, but it gave us a lot of visual things that we couldn't afford to pay for, and it added to the production of the show. And years later, this Major Abel that I worked with, when I was retired, happened to make a trip to Washington to visit a friend of mine who worked for the Pentagon, and he took me on a tour of the Pentagon, and lo and behold, who did I run into? Was Major Abel, who's now General Abel, which is a small world.
It seems to happen a lot.
Huh?
It seems to happen a lot.
Yeah, it is.
Tell me about the theme song to Hawaii Five-0.
The theme song was written for the pilot, and it was conceived by Mort Stevens. He was head of the music department at that time, a wonderful man, and it just caught on. I mean, in fact, the local high schools over there played it at their football games. It was, and the University of Hawaii also. Living there so long, I got involved, and I had season tickets at the university, and they played that. I just loved, hearing that there. And a few years after the show was on the air, then a group called the Avengers recorded it, and it became very popular.
The Ventures.
Avengers, yeah. Sorry.
So the Ventures, so interesting. The Ventures didn't record the original theme, right? They recorded it after.
No, they did their own version.
Okay.
Right. Yes.
Interesting. And the new version of Hawaii Five-0 uses the same theme, correct?
Right.
Okay. What about the production process differed from shooting in LA or in the States, budget-wise? Were things just more expensive? Were they cheaper? What was different about it in Hawaii?
Well, first of all, we had to take some crew from here, so there were 23 at the time of mainland crew, and then we filled in the rest with local crew. So there was housing and feeding and transportation for the crew to come over. There was no equipment, production equipment. That had to be shipped over by Matson container ships. And so we had to bring over all the grips and electrical and cameras, etc. The cost of living in Hawaii, the food costs are higher, but you don't wear, as far as living there, from a personal standpoint, you're mostly in Aloha shirts and wash and wear, clothing. The locations in the beginning, we got the locations fairly reasonable, but people become savvy, and we use a lot of big, expensive homes on the Kahala coast. Today, I imagine the new Hawaii Five is paying a lot more than we paid. But the town itself, or the people, were very cooperative because we were new at the time, and they would work with you. I mean, we got a lot of locations that you might not be able to get over here because they wanted to be a part of it. They sometimes resented, that we portrayed crime, but most of the people understood.
Was the show a hit right out of the box?
No, the first few years it wasn't, and Mike Dan at that time was head of programming for CBS, and he played with the schedule, and later came Fred Silverman, but they finally got it in a slot, and then it took off, and did very well after that. And you were talking, okay.
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, we were talking earlier, and I passed over it. The titles. The titles, they were done. The first season, the titles for the pilot were different than the ones for the series. CBS hired Reza Badi, and Reza came over and mapped out the titles. And at the time, we were doing some heavy other shows, and since I was in the office as assistant production supervisor, production supervisor, I got to go with Reza on the titles, and he was amazing. I mean, he was doing, things, he was creating as we went, and they became really some of the best titles, that have ever been seen, like with Jack on the top of the Ilokai when the helicopter's flying in. Running through Waikiki, with MacArthur running down the street, after, a criminal, or the motorcycle, he was sitting on the back of a motorcycle. And then we went out to the airport and shot as the plane, underneath the bottom of the plane on the tarmac. Just fascinating stuff. And he was just shooting from the hip.
The wave shots in the beginning, were
the
they
wave
shot?
shot they had made on the pilot.
Were they shot by the production team, or were they was it stock footage?
Well, they had a little of both, yeah. And the girl running across the beach, that was stuff they had done for the pilot.
What were the challenges unique to shooting in Hawaii, location-wise?
The challenges of shooting
That you didn't have to deal with working in L.A. or the States.
Well, they didn't have a permit process. They probably do now. I don't know. We could.
What about weather? Just the nature of the place.
Weather was always there, but usually we could run to the stage. The whole time that I was there, we never lost a day to inclement weather. Many times I would battle with the director. It would start raining, and they thought it was going to rain all day, but it never did. If it came from the ocean, then you knew you were going to have a problem and it should go inside. It might rain all day if it came from the ocean, but if it came from the mountainside, we used to call that pineapple juice, and just keep shooting or wait till it stopped. But many times Jack would argue with me that we should go inside, or the visiting director, because he didn't know, the weather over there. The weather would, change fast and go right back to being a nice, bright lit sunshine day.
Was Jack Lord hard on directors and guest actors, or
Usually, he could be. There's some that he respected more than others, and Jack also directed some, as well. There were good days and bad days, like in everything.
What percentage? Go ahead.
For example, one of the producers I mentioned earlier was Bill Finnegan, and he got into a confrontation with Bill, and he told him to get off the island one day, and we had to shut down after a week of not having anything left to shoot without Jack, because he wouldn't come to work until Bill was gone. Well, at the time, Bob Wood was president of the network, and he was trying to come up with something to resolve this, and so were Lenny and, the producers. So they finally agreed that Bill would finish, the year, but I would be the one who talked with Jack, and if he had any script changes or anything that he needed, he didn't have to deal with Bill. At the end of the day, Bill was gone the next year, and on to something, better for him anyway.
Mm.
But he, let everybody believe that it was his show, but it was not. It was Lenny's and the network's.
About what percentage was shot on stages as opposed to on location in Hawaii?
We used to do 5 days location and 2 days studio. We did what we call as bottle shows at the end of the year when we wanted to get. We did our bigger shows early in the season. At the end of the year, we would do a show. It was more self-contained, so we didn't go out. But even when you did a bottle show, you didn't lay off the drivers, and the trucks were just parked outside the stage. The savings was the hours, the travel time.
So why was more money spent early on in the season than later?
To get the ratings, to go for the ratings, get your audience.
Were there when you were shooting, when the show became popular and people in Hawaii knew about it, did you have issues with crowd control, people getting in shots, things like that?
No, because we would hire the local police, would be our crowd control, and we had people who wanted to come to the set, but we couldn't do that because it was just be impossible to keep up with all of that. But we were all over the islands; they could watch us. But it was interesting. Even then, Jack wanted a closed set, no visitors, even when you're out on the streets of Waikiki. So he didn't want the crew or the families, to bring their family or friends around. And yet he could turn around on that too. I happened to have my in-laws were visiting and my parents one year, and we were shooting down at the Iolani Palace. And I said they couldn't come to the set; they wanted to come and see the shoot. And we were meeting for lunch during that day, so my wife and my father and mother and my in-laws, my mother-in-law and father-in-law were standing under a banyan tree because it was a hot, day, waiting for them to finish, and Jack was going to be gone after 12 o'clock that particular day. And all of a sudden, he goes back to his motorhome, and he comes out while he's there and looks, and he sees me talking to some people over there, and he asked me, who was that? And I told him it was my parents, and they were visiting, and my in-laws. And he invited them into his motorhome. It was very gracious. So you never knew, You just kind of go by the rules, and, it usually worked out.
What was the most difficult part of your job on Hawaii Five-0?
Contending with him, because he would get upset and wanted to replace somebody. And it isn't like you can call on the phone and say, get me so-and-so tomorrow. And some of these people didn't deserve replacing. It's just his outburst at the time, and the hours that you work. We were shooting originally 6 days a week. So Sunday was the day of reading the script and getting ready for the next show. So I kept trying to show him in the budget because there was an extra payment for Jack on Saturday, and the crew got either time and a half or double time depending on what who was working what that week in those days in the contracts, and show him that it was costing him so much more, even though we extended the season because they wanted to get him shot in so many days and get back, and wrap the show by a certain time each year. So we finally convinced him where we were taking like every other Saturday off in later years.
What makes a good production manager? I mean, what are the qualities that you have to bring to that job to be good at that?
Well, you have to know what things cost and what, the ability to get along with the crews and the people that you're working with, and how to lay out a schedule and be able to revamp it if necessary, and improvise, and consider all the elements and the pieces that go into to be aware of all those things.
Does personality matter?
Oh, definitely, yeah.
It sounds like from your end, knowing how to manage people, or at least certainly get along with them, goes a long way toward being able to do your job. Is that right?
That always works very well for you.
Are there things that were unique to a police procedural show, budget-wise, that you didn't have to deal with on other shows you managed?
I'm not sure what you mean.
In terms of the hardware, the anything that might have to do with the theme of working with a police squad, with law enforcement, anything like that. And it was just another challenge to overcome, basically, or?
It was another challenge to overcome, but we had like the prop masters handle all the weapons, and they were well trained in with the weapon. I personally knew nothing about weapons. Fired a gun once in my life.
It sounded like what you said earlier, that you had great cooperation from the military. Was that also true from law enforcement in Hawaii?
Yes. Uh-huh.
Did they seem proud of the fact the show was done there? And also, how did the people, how did the citizens of Hawaii feel about the show?
Oh, they loved the show. Everybody talked about it. It was something they wanted to be involved with or be able to to see it. It opened doors. They treated us like royalty. I mean, that was in those days. I don't know how the present show is going to go. Well, I happened to talk to what's his name, Kevin, the current head of production at CBS, and he said, "Well, you probably had it easy when you did it." I had called once and offered advice. Initially, when they were preparing the new series, what's his name? Ed does criminal. Ed. Let me stop for a minute. Let me think for a minute. Oh, yeah, I'm ready.
Okay, go ahead.
Ed Bernero was going to do the pilot, and I happened to meet him, and he had asked me to maybe be a technical advisor or something, and then it turned out that his script wasn't selected. So I had called the head of CBS production to see if I could, give any advice or anything. And he said, well, they're getting things under control now. This was after they had done their pilot. And he mentioned that we probably had it easy when we were there. And we probably did, because we were new to them. And sometimes you can wear on people. But when we had a local guy who did the location work for us, Randy Spangler. And when he would go to some of these, in those days they were $1 million homes. Today they're $20 million homes or whatever on the beach. But I was surprising, how much cooperation we got and let us in on their property, with the full crew and everything, because they could tell their friends at a Wi-Fi show, 5-0 it shot there, I guess.
Was there a lot of input from CBS? Did you have to, did they give input on a regular basis?
Yes, they did. And they also came, as I mentioned earlier, the network at that time, Fred's, in later years, Fred Silmer was running programming, and he came out. And Perry Lafferty and Paul King were on the West Coast. They came out. In fact, Fred came out because he was out to see Bill Conrad, who was doing Canada at the time, came to vacation. They had called me if I could help him find somewhere to stay, on the beach somewhere. And I initially got him into the Kahala Condominium Association, and then later there was a penthouse over at the Colony Surf Hotel. So I became friends with Bill. And then when Fred came out, he and Bill got together, and also Bob Wood, who was president of the network, had come out to the islands. Of course, there's not many shows that were shooting in that kind of a location, so they would make it a point, to come out. And I remember picking up Bob Wood at the airport, and I dropped him off the Kahala, and he said, "No, I want you to stay with me because I want you to tell me what Jack Lord's going to ask me." And here I am meeting, if I was a unit manager or production manager or another show in Hollywood, I wouldn't be, dealing with those people. But it was a whole different ball game over there. Yeah, we were the only game in town, and it was very interesting.
As the show went through several seasons, did the network regard it as something that they didn't have to get involved with as much? They could just trust that it would run okay? Or was there more, involvement, more input?
It's hard for me to answer that question because, I didn't participate in those meetings,
What was the effect, when Leonard Freeman died during season 6, what effect did that have on the production, the cast, the crew?
Well, we were naturally very all sad and broken up. The scripts, by that time it built a fairly good writing team, and the people who took over at that time had all worked on some of the shows with Lenny's. We missed him considerably, but we were able to keep going. It was, I'm sure it wasn't, the same quality all the way around with the scripts and stories. But, once a show has been established like that, I guess it's easier. It must have been, because it survived several more years after that.
So tell me about your promotion in the last 2 seasons, and how that affected your location, your life.
Well, at the end of the 10th season, as I said, I had worked on another pilot, and I had a choice to make between whether I wanted to stay. I could stay on 5-0, I could continue because the show was picked up to go, or do this other series as a producer. And then there were some changes at CBS in Los Angeles. Bob Nerved, who was running CBS Studio Center, was asked to come over to Television City, Bob, head of the West Coast operation, and wanted Bob to replace somebody that had passed away over there. And Bob initially had turned it down because he liked the job at Studio Center, but they said if he didn't take it, they would have to put somebody else in there and be over him. So he made the move, and he'd moved Eddie Denault into his job as vice president general manager. And then they asked me to come over to replace Eddie in the production job. And my kids didn't want to go at all. I mean, they were, one of them was going to Punahou. In fact, my second daughter was in school with a guy who's now our president. She was in school with Barry Obama, which that was what he was going by then. And
was that high school? Or?
High school, Punahou.
Back in Hawaii. Okay.
In Hawaii.
So the kids didn't want to come back to the States?
They didn't want to come back. My wife and I thought, well, she loved it too, but if I was ever going to do anything in the business, you'd have to come back here. And so it was a wonderful opportunity, and I had to give notice there. Jack didn't want me to go, and he felt I was a traitor. There was a period of time after I left that he didn't even want to talk to me. And so
That's
I came.
very interesting.
Yeah.
It sounds like you got along with him. You were able to find a way to get along with him.
Yeah. And he felt, I was leaving the show before, that I should be leaving the show.
What was your new title when you for those last?
When
2
I
years?
first came back, I was production manager of CBS West Coast, and then shortly thereafter, made me vice president. Oh, executive in charge of production, I guess is what it was said. And Eddie only stayed in the job as general manager of the studio for a year. He didn't like that end of the business. He liked the production side. And eventually he went to Lorimar. So the general manager's job was open as well. And Bob Nervette had asked me if I wanted to do that. And I'd only done the other job for a year, and I said, I'm not being presumptuous or better than anybody, but I think I can do both, because we weren't doing that many in-house shows. The CBS was doing more shows with other companies, and I could look over Hawaii Five-0 and, you know, a couple of shows, and they agreed to it. So I became the vice president, general manager of CBS Studio Center, and I still had the production job. And eventually was able to bring Rita Burton, who was a young woman over from Television City, and put her in to help me with the studio negotiations as far as renting the facilities and so forth.
So when you left Hawaii, did someone take your place physically there? That was
Yeah,
under your management?
Yeah, there is, well, at the time, as I said, Jack Lord wasn't talking with me.
Right.
And the current line producer and the producers of 5-0 here in Hollywood, I couldn't actually physically talk to him. So behind the scenes, we hired another production manager. But during the time that I left, there were like 3 other guys, because of the relationships with Jack and the problems on the show, where we had to replace people in my job. 3 or 4, I think, as I remember that.
So you'd been focusing on one show for 10 years, and then you came back here and had to supervise the shows that CBS was doing.
Right.
Which you said wasn't a tremendous amount more, but still it was more than one series. What was that like for you, that transition to supervise multiple shows?
Actually, I found it easier because I wasn't working the hours that I did in Honolulu on production. Although I was always the guy that put in the hours, because I felt, you know, really keep up with everything. But I didn't have to be there as much. And I like dealing with the people at the studio. I had wonderful department heads that Bob and Eddie had put together, and I was able to work with a lot of those people.
How did Hawaii Five-0 stay fresh through so many seasons?
The writers and some of the stories they did were, I think, more than typical police shows. You know, Strangers in Your Old Land, V for Vashon, some of the excellent episodes. And a lot of the locations had never been seen before because it wasn't stuff that you'd see in all over LA that people were familiar with. You know, we shot all over the island, North Shore, Kailua, Kaneohe, you know, Eva, Diamond Head. You know, there was enough to get, you know, new and fresh looks.
Did viewers feedback to CBS that the fact that it was physically shot in Hawaii was one of the attractions to the show?
Well, I found that a lot of the people, and sometimes between seasons you fly on, we had to deal with United Airlines, and you sit on planes and you're talking to people, and that was what they told us too. A lot of people just had never been to Hawaii. They were coming because of the show.
For the shows that you had to supervise through your career, did you watch them, or were you kind of like, next? I mean, that's done. You know.
Oh no, I watched as many as I could. Yeah, I like to see how they turned out.
Were there any favorite episodes of Hawaii Five-0 that you liked?
I'd say the trilogy, the V for Vashon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Why do people still think of Hawaii Five-0 as one of their favorites? It's been off the air for the original.
Uh, I think a lot of it because either they had been to Hawaii or they hadn't been to Hawaii, but it was something where they want to go someday. And those who'd been remember the fun experiences they had, and they like what they saw. They liked Jack. He came off well on the screen, and Jimmy, and all the local cast, a lot of local characters and cast members. They were very good at what they did.
What did those 12 years on the show teach you about being a production manager? Any new tricks you learned?
Any what, I'm sorry?
Any new tricks you learned?
It's hard to say. You always learn from your experiences. Just working with people and working with Hawaiians too. A lot of things. You get more out of people. You treat them nice. I never was a screamer, but I saw how other people would sometimes use that way to get things done. They were very kind, gentle people. You're working with Samoans, Hawaiians, Asians, and it was a wonderful experience working with that culture and the people. I also, because I was there so long, the mayor asked me to get involved in the community, and I was appointed commissioner for culture and the arts, and worked with picking art objects, and which I knew very little about, but we, would pick places and things with other people who did know what they were doing. And I found that interesting, because again, I say, in Los Angeles, you don't get involved in that, but being the only game in town, you do a lot of things that you wouldn't do here in Los Angeles, and working with those people.
So what do you think of the reboot of Hawaii Five-0 that's currently on the air?
I like the way they're shooting it. They've got bigger budgets than we do. Like, we would get a helicopter maybe 3 or 4 times a year to get, helicopter shots. They must have a standing helicopter. You see parts of the island that we never showed before, and I think it looks beautiful. I think they're doing a good job, yeah.
Did you have any expectation before it premiered about what it might be? Good or bad?
Yeah, I thought, because of some of the other series that have tried, to come back, that are made into movies, like you had mentioned earlier in our conversation. I think they're doing, a very good job. Some of the stories, I'm not sure they're going for those unusual, Pacific area shows. They have tried on some occasions and have done some good jobs, but unfortunately, there's only so many things you can do, and it ends up being a police show in a lot of ways. But I enjoy watching it. I watch it on a regular basis.
Yeah, you had mentioned that the original show had some unusual crimes that seemed to be kind of Hawaii-based, or
right.
Things you wouldn't normally see.
Well, that's what they were trying initially, but it was hard to keep those going.
When you became the executive in charge of production for CBS after Hawaii Five-0, what was the status of CBS at the time? How are they doing in terms of the other networks and the success they had with shows on the air? This would be, I guess, the early 80s.
Yeah, not as well as they're doing now. I'm sorry. No, most of the hits at that time, I think, were on NBC. So in answer to your question, I would say they weren't doing as well as they wanted to at that time. They were winding down with a lot of the shows that had been hits earlier, like the Beverly Hillbillies and what was it, Green Acres and those type of shows.
Well, when you
And
came,
5-0, is over in '79.
when you came back from Hawaii, what other shows were you involved with?
Mostly 2-hour movies. The network was doing a lot of 2-hour movies at the time, probably as many as 50 in development. And then we were doing a bunch in-house and others farmed out to other production companies. So I'd have to read a lot of scripts and work with the estimators who did the budgets for me now and break those down. And then if we did something, I would initially go, if I had the time, and set them up like we did one in Chicago, 3 or 4 in New York, one in New Orleans. I worked with Gil Cates on one, which I enjoyed, Hobson's Choice. We did a thing called Muggle Milmere with Karen Valentine that I worked with Neil Maffio and Sandy Stern. That almost became a series. I worked in Chicago with Kate Jackson and what's the young actor again? Don Taylor was the director. And shot there. But I initially went and made some of the deals. Then they hired production managers, unit managers, to actually be on the sets, on the location when they shot them.
You said 50 movies a year. That's a lot of TV movies. And it's gone like from that to about 0 now.
It was, Bill Self was running the division, and then you had Steve Mills and Bob Silberling.
What was the average production schedule in terms of days for doing a TV movie back then?
As few as 18 days, and as many as 21, I would say, was an average.
Was there a certain formula that CBS tried to create with those movies, or was it several genres? Like today, Hallmark has a certain, or Lifetime has a certain style of movie.
Right.
But
they had several genres, I would say. I maintain a relationship with Bob Silberling, who was in that department. Unfortunately, he has ALS now.
Did you have a stable of producers you worked with on the in-house TV movies?
No, they would bring in different producers. Steve and Bill and Bob would hire their producers, and there were different producers they brought in.
But for you, was there any essential difference from supervising episodic 1 hours to supervising TV movies?
The episodics, you were trying to rein them in more. I think they had more autonomy in the 2 hours.
From a budget standpoint, did you have to learn new things with the movies?
Not really, I don't think. I did one that Rob Reiner had written. We shot here around, it was a thing. He used to play a lot of softball, I guess, when he was younger, and he had written a softball script with young married people who played softball. And that was a fun experience working with Rob. But he didn't direct it. It was directed by, I can't remember his name. We had done a lot of directing and features and everything, but he acted in it. But he also produced it.
Okay, we're going to change tape.
Okay.